Okay, so my conversation today is on townships and black pain registers, right? So is looked at through a lens which is called black geography and affect. So black geography is a sociological theory which looks at landscape not only as physical, right, but as human beings attempt to represent humanity. So it's not just a place, it's your humanity which is discursive within the landscape. So in this regard, what you're asking is how then do townships feed off the emotional or affective understandings of black pain? So black pain, we are now talking about pain that owes its origin to racialization, to to racism, racialization, and race, right? So then you understand this understanding of black pain means it's you are denoting the type of power that creates this pain. And what you look at is you want to look at how is the black subject created in how he interacts with his own suffering or with their own suffering, with her own suffering. You you want to assess the the idea that the body is discursive. What is discursive? It means that when you walk into a room, there is a history that follows you because you are black, right? That history that follows you is the way in which you will interact with things. So, for instance, I look at, in my research, I look at affective economies of fear in racialization and how does that link to townships. And what you find is that townships are a representation of whiteness's fear of extinction. When whiteness is it feels threatened, there's a creation of panic. There's a creation of panic within the society which mobilizes resources towards actual um, implementation of easing the anxiety. So townships become that. During the apartheid era, you've got figures like Verwoerd, who's well known as the architect of apartheid, and he mobilizes fear by using the idea of white poverty and what was called then Swartgevaar. And Swartgevaar is racial discourse that mobilizes fear by teaching whiteness that integration with blackness or with black bodies would lead to extinction. So therefore mobilizing the very same anxieties that white people have carried for hundreds and hundreds of years of extinction. To understand these theories, you have to look at the history of in which whiteness comes out, right? War-torn Europe, survival, and that's where they come from. They come from this war culture, and in response to being threatened, the only response is violence. And now you create townships which remain standing violence and have gained naturalization within the democratic South Africa, right? So the naturalization is the question: is how then do we know these things as how do we know these things as apartheid constructions, but still let them survive throughout the democratic South Africa, right? So that becomes the question that you want to answer with the understanding of black geographies and affect. So you are, in essence, asking the question of does society naturalize the suffering of black people? So as Warren lets us know that race is a war discourse. If there is race in a society, if there's racialization, it means there's somebody under threat and there's somebody who's the threat. And Fanon notes but he notes it as the black body is an object of fear in racialized society. And that's how we are responded to. And what do you do with something that scares you? You get rid of it. You put it in places that you don't find, that you can't see. So townships function to keep white anxieties in check by putting the object of fear far enough for contact, but also close enough to fail. Townships also fail in the fact that we are able to go into these white spaces and travel. This is the democratic South Africa, but all that does is recreate different types of white white geographies, right? You go from suburbs, and then after 1994, you've got all these gated communities that come up, but they don't come up for any other reason other than to keep the fear, the black body out. So then how do we imagine? The question then, the final question becomes a very simple one. It becomes, what is the collective imagination on where we would find black people? Where can we imagine a different space for black people to exist other than existing in misery within townships? And this becomes a very difficult one, because within the collective imagination, there is no other place for black people to exist other than townships, so much so that even us have been forced to accept this as our existence. We normalize this existence because there is no other thing that we know, and there is no other thing that we can imagine. And that is the inquiry into black geographies. We are looking at how then are townships a recreation of our humanity or lack thereof. You see, what townships give power is the ability to give you conditions that precede you, right? You are black because you are born in a township. You are in a township because you are black. And if you are living through the same conditions as most of your ancestors in these black geographies, what then becomes the psychological effect? How then do you rationalize existence if all you know is violence as your own existence? You have settled in the loss that comes with townships, the forced removals, all of the history that comes with the dispossession of blackness is where we are forced to settle. You know, a township is a representation of dispossession, but the solution in South Africa for the homeless is to build more townships and house them in smaller spaces. How do you imagine somebody's going to survive with no money in a smaller space in the same townships that was created to destroy? If you go back to figures like Verwoerd, for instance, who was a psychologist and mobilized a lot of Stellenbosch intellectual. Yeah. So these guys sit and by process of elimination look at which is the best way to assume power over black people. And Verwoerd insists on separate development, which is what precedes township. Separate development precedes township, followed by the 1950s Land Area Act, Groups Area Act, sorry. So all of these laws that control where black bodies are supposed to be and when they're not supposed to be have become naturalized. Even today, every black person knows where they're supposed to be and when they're not supposed to be. You know where you're welcome and where you're not welcome. So that becomes a part of you inhibiting the geography, right? You inhibit your own oppression because you don't deserve anything more than where you have been put. So the question on that Verwoerd and some of these guys were wrestling with was, how do we create enough dread so that these people will have more time to wallow in their suffering than to fight for liberation? And Verwoerd comes up with separate development and townships, and he, power always uses language of care, right? Separate development, as if you take people, dispossess them, put them in townships, there's development. That's why now we are calling things, what is this, when people are protesting, a service delivery. We have moved into a different language, but with the same situation. So Verwoerd introduces some things, a few things along with creating townships, such as alcohol, for instance. Before Verwoerd, alcohol was not necessarily, sold to black people. Black people were drinking certain types of alcohol. And he said, no, we are creating a particular type of living condition. They will be depressed, anxiety, and these are the things that will allow them to self-medicate, but also beneficial for capitalism. So you are now talking about black suffering that is not a mistake. It's not something that was not planned out. It's not a surprise to the system. In fact, some of the work that we see in annihilist literature and work such as that of Orlando Pitson is that the world can't imagine itself without black people suffering. So suffering for black people, what the mistake we have made is assume that it can be fixed within a particular discourse. This is a mistake, and that's what geography allows. It allows for the suffering to be put so far away from everybody's view that it becomes an error of the system when people voice it out. So the connection between black pain and society and the constructions of black geography is that Black pain in itself is necessary for development. The world cannot imagine development or civilization, so to speak, that's a proper term, civilization without black people suffering for it. Whether you look back to the slave ages, whether you look, there has never been a time in history of development without black suffering. So how then do we think we have imagined it now in the democratic South Africa? When townships still exist, how do we name this country a free country? When townships we know would qualify to be war geography, similar to concentration camps or forced encampments in Uganda. These are the same constructions. When there's a war, you put the people that you are up against in areas where they have less access to resource to secure power. And that is what black geographies have become, and this is why we have seen a degeneration, a moral degeneration, a psychological degeneration. What we are seeing now is a society living pathologically on an everyday basis, right? You are seeing consistent need for meaningless constructs of fear or of happiness. We are consistently trying to find some kind of happiness, whether this is creating the latest dance or whatever it is that we will do that will give us some sort of meaning and contribution to the world. And that's what black geography does, is that it strips us of contributions to the world. We are in the reserves of the world. Nobody knows this place. We are both somewhere and nowhere at the same time. And I think my conclusion would be that we must then question what is going to be the new collective imagination, should we want one, and should there be no violent response to a request for one.